One sort of barrier between the real him and the audience that I think every sort of front performer needs.
I mean, I don't suppose you can avoid it when people go, oh, him, you know, he looks like Joe Brand, or, you know, and the lippy and stuff. But, you know, I've never, ever, I mean, I've always seen past it. And it's just the way he is. And I rather admire him for sticking to it as well. Isn't it true that Mary, she always liked him wearing the lippy and stuff? And so he said, well, you know, if she likes it, I'll keep it. Fair enough.
I started wearing it on stage just because I've got very ill-defined features and I just wanted to make more of them. So it's not so much vanity, I don't think, because it's a bit too odd to be vanity. It's more theatricality.
Robert Smith's image was incredibly important to the Cure's popularity, I think. It was very clever because it was a very androgynous image, so you could copy it if you were a boy or a girl, which is quite unusual, you know, amongst rock stars generally. You know, you might get loads of blokes dressing up as you might get loads of girls dressing up as you, but you very rarely get both. But Robert Smith, if you went to one of his gigs, then, you know, it was actually quite difficult to tell the boys and the girls apart because they'd all have a ridiculous, you know, giant black widow spider perched on their heads. They'd all be dressed in black. A lot of them would be wearing sort of dubious, smudged makeup. And it was brilliant if you were a Cure fan because you could instantly recognise other Cure fans. You know, if you were on your first day at college or, you know, at an indie disco, there was none of this, you know, sort of wondering, oh, I wonder if they like the same music as me, because if they were a Cure fan, you just knew because they looked like Robert Smith. So you could just walk up and say, no, into the Cure by any chance? And they'd always say yes.
The tensions within the Cure that surfaced during Smith's flirtation with the Banshees came to a head in late 1979. Smith felt that an irreconcilable breach had developed between he and Dempsey was ejected from the band to be replaced by Smith's longtime friend Simon Gallup. Keyboard player Matthew Hartley was asked to join the group, and in early 1980 the new four-piece begun recording their second studio album, 17 Seconds. Standout track A Forest earned high praise from the music press.
Killing an Arab is the one that's been, from the start, has been a really famous song. But Boys Don't Cry is the first kind of hit, and that's the one that kind of crossed them over quite a lot. But for me, the one song that really defines the Cure for me personally is A Forest. It's just got everything that's great about the Cure. It's very sparse. It sounds a bit like the first album. It's got a kind of weird kind of sound to it, and it's very poppy, melodic. But it also sounds like that quintessential kind of dark, moody Cure. That kind of, and it's got that kind of weird kind of dream, childlike dream kind of feel to it. It's a very, I say modern, but I mean late 70s kind of piece of psychedelia. It's kind of very post-punk psychedelic. It's a very black and white kind of sound to it. And it sounds like it come from any kind of period of their career. It would fit in any album. So to me, A Forest is definitely the quintessential Cure track.
No, I mean, for me, the big one that really changed my whole mind about the Cure was A Forest. And I just thought that was a wonderful combination of spooky guitars and a dream voice, and there a formula seemed to be developing. Yeah, the voice, the guitar, and also an image that seemed very specific to Robert Smith and his mental state. You know, his mental state is always a key factor in a Cure song. The combination of quite ordinariness, really, down-to-earthness, and yet something very strange and bizarre and far-fetched. So he's quite rooted in a funny sort of way, but he's also completely, you know, off his head. And I guess that was the moment when I first started to notice that was an interesting tension.
The Cure's first world tour followed the release of 17 Seconds, but was marred by further bust-ups, which culminated in Hartley leaving the group. Reformed as a three-piece, The Cure began work on their next album, Faith.
The Cure have been through various different incarnations, so I think when you look at the early stuff, they were by no means a sort of ordinary band, but they were much more ordinary than they became. So songs like, you know, Boys Don't Cry, which is an absolutely classic, you know, Cure pop song, was this kind of wiry, minimalist punk thing. You know, if I got into them in 1979 and heard a song like that, I'm sure I'd have really liked it. but in a way you wouldn't have thought they were sort of a band that was going to go on to make 10 albums and become one of the biggest bands in the world. They seemed like a quirky British thing, their early stuff. It was when they got into the real gloomy stuff, faith and pornography, that was when the band really started to sort of resonate with a wider fan base.
By faith, which to me was, when it started to become interesting, there was a seriousness about the way that they were using sound, so they could obviously write these kind of very haunting and attractive pop songs, and Like a Forest was so seductive, and it seemed to have that combination of being about sound, pure sound coming out of Eno and Bowie, but also the idea of the pop song coming out of the more sort of stranger end of David Bowie. And I guess because Diamond Dogs was almost an original example of what became known as the Gothic sound, Diamond Dogs was almost ground zero for that, in a way, along with the American band The Doors, those were the two areas where it began. And so it was when the Cure started to really kind of get that sense that they had their own identity coming out of something that was interesting. But it was, a mix, Bowie kind of jumped from one thing to the other. The Cure seemed to put it all in one place. So there were these, gorgeous soundscapes and occasionally these ravishing pop songs.
In the winter of 1982, The Cure embarked on a UK tour supported by Steve Severin of Susie and the Banshees. When the tour wrapped up in December, the band retreated to the Windmill studio to rehearse some new material. It was during these brief sessions that new tensions began to flare up, with Gallup accusing Smith of wanting to leave The Cure to collaborate with Severin. A confused and distant Smith journeyed to London and stayed at Severin's house, where he wrote the bulk of the lyrics for Pornography.
Robert was in this sort of this sort of limbo between not sure. He wasn't really sure whether he wanted The Cure to continue or whether he wanted to go solo. So it was sort of mid-82. And he just used to turn up on my doorstep at, Friday night with a crate of different sort of beverages, and he'd sit there making cocktails, and we'd talk and watch videos because I'd just got a video player.
Him and Severin sort of became quite good buddies and had all sorts of experiments with psychedelia music, and I suppose took a lot of acid together and kind of lived quite an extreme life and found connections with things they were interested in. I think the darker side of David Bowie, Robert Smith, sort of mapped onto Severin's kind of appreciation of truly dark things in life and the Edgar Allan Poe and everything. And I suppose they did find a way to fit into the same glove, which was kind of interesting.
In early 1982, The Cure recruited producer Phil Thornley to begin recording Pornography at Rack Studios in London. The album was released in May 1982 to tepid reviews, and the ensuing tour was a disaster. A fistfight between Smith and Gallup ended the bassist's involvement with the band. Chris Parry tried to encourage Smith to take a new, more mainstream pop direction. Tolhurst moved on to keys, and the band began recording upbeat singles such as Let's Go to Bed and The Walk, with session musicians on bass and drums. Smith, however, remained distracted and began to move closer to Severin, collaborating on a joint project, The Glove, as well as recording and touring with the Banshees.
We got a lot of negative vibes, as we should say, from Fiction, because they felt Robert was getting pulled in too many directions. I think I was seen as like, this kind of elemental on his shoulder, whispering in his ear, telling him not to be The Cure, and which wasn't the case at all. It was just that, and I was there at one meeting with him and Chris Parry, where he explained quite eloquently why he wanted to go and play with the Banshees for a second time, why he wanted to do the Glove album, just to get different experiences to add to The Cure. And but I think Chris was very nervous that he was going to go off and leave The Cure behind and join the Banshees permanently. So there was this tug of war going on, which manifested itself more during the recording of the Banshees album Hyena in '84 that we did with Robert. The actual Glove sessions were they left us alone, they never thought, It was kind of like, oh, let the two boys have their holiday and, you know, they'll come back to their senses eventually.
In September 1983, The Glove released their only album, Blue Sunshine.
The Glove got sort of mixed reviews. People to this day either love it or hate it. But by that point, you know, the Banshees were suffering their first